The ledger hit the sheriff's desk with a sound like a gunshot, and Alma Hale's hands were trembling not from fear, but from the sheer, overwhelming weight of what she now knew. "Every name," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, her dark eyes fixed on Robert Conroy's face with an intensity that could have cut glass. "Every single name, every transaction, every bribe paid, and every life bought. It is all here, Robert. All of it. And one of those names is going to destroy everything you thought you knew about this town." Robert Conroy stood across from her, 6 feet 2 inches of solid frontier lawman, his jaw set like the bluffs above the Cimarron River, his gray eyes locked on the open ledger between them. He had carried that book for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of sleepless nights, 3 weeks of turning its pages in the lamplight until his eyes burned, 3 weeks of consulting every man he thought might have even a passing familiarity with codes and ciphers. 3 weeks of absolute, infuriating silence from the pages themselves, and in 4 hours, Alma Hale had cracked it open like an egg. "Say the name," he said, and his voice was dangerously quiet. Alma pressed her finger to a line of translated text she had written in her own neat, precise hand on the paper beside the ledger, and she looked up at him with an expression that mixed triumph with something much heavier, something that looked almost like grief. "Deputy Harris Cade," she said. "Your own deputy, Robert. He has been selling land deeds to the Holloway gang for 2 years. Every raid, every ambush, every family that lost their home and their livestock, and sometimes their lives, Harris Cade told Holloway exactly where to strike and when, and he was paid handsomely for every single one." The silence in the sheriff's office was absolute. Then Robert Conroy's hand came down on the desk so hard the inkwell rattled, and the man who had not broken a visible sweat while staring down 6 armed outlaws outside the Dusty Creek saloon 3 months prior looked, for one terrible moment, like the ground had opened beneath his feet. That was how it ended. But the story of how it began, and how a cipher expert from the East Coast found herself in the wild, burning heart of Redemption, Kansas in the spring of 1882, and how she and a hard-jawed sheriff stopped trusting their walls long enough to let each other in, that story deserves to be told from the very beginning. Alma Hale arrived in Redemption on the afternoon stage on the 14th of April, 1882, and the first thing she noticed about the town was that it was smaller than the letter had promised and considerably more dangerous than the advertisement had implied. The second thing she noticed was that nobody came to meet her. She stepped down from the Concord coach with her trunk, her leather satchel, and a carpet bag that contained, among other things, 3 published monographs on polyalphabetic substitution ciphers, a copy of Kasiski's work on index of coincidence analysis, 2 notebooks filled with her own research, and a very small, very accurate Remington Derringer that she had no intention of using, but was perfectly prepared to if necessary. Redemption, Kansas had approximately 400 residents, and the kind of permanent tension in the air that Alma associated with places where the law was present but not entirely in control. The main street was wide and unpaved, rutted by wagon wheels, flanked by storefronts with sun-bleached painted signs. There was a general mercantile, a livery stable, a small bank, a doctor's office, and a 2-story building with a sign that read Redemption Hotel and Saloon in letters that had once been gold and were now the color of old mustard. She had been hired through a carefully worded letter sent to her employer in Washington, D.C., a private consulting firm that specialized in document analysis for government agencies and private concerns, to examine a ledger that had been recovered from the body of a man named Frank Tully, who had been found shot dead near the Cimarron River 3 weeks earlier. The local sheriff had determined that the ledger was written in some kind of code, that it likely contained information about criminal operations in and around Redemption County, and that he needed someone who could read it. What the letter had not specified was that the sheriff himself would be the one who sent for her, or that he would be the most formidably handsome, deeply private, and thoroughly aggravating man she had encountered in considerable professional travels. She found the sheriff's office herself, because no one offered to guide her, and she had never been the kind of woman who waited to be guided. She pushed open the door, stepped into a room that smelled of gun oil and coffee, and something faintly like cedar, and found herself looking at the back of a man who was standing at the window with his arms crossed, staring out at the street. He turned at the sound of the door, and Alma's first impression of Robert Conroy was that he was built like someone had set out to construct a human being specifically suited for surviving the frontier. He was broad through the shoulders, lean through the waist, with the kind of physical presence that took up a room without being obtrusive about it. He had dark brown hair that had been recently cut, but was already growing into something less neat, a jaw shadowed with 2 days of dark beard, and gray eyes that assessed her with a directness that she found, after a lifetime of being looked through by men who assumed that a woman's intelligence was decorative at best, genuinely startling. He did not look at her the way men usually looked at her. He looked at her the way he probably looked at everything, like he was deciding what it was and what it was capable of. "Miss Hale," he said. "Dr. Hale," she said, not unkindly but with absolute precision. "I hold a degree from the Stevens Institute of Technology in New Jersey, class of 1878. I have been corresponding with William Friedman's predecessor at the Army Signal Corps since 1879, and I have successfully translated 19 coded documents for federal investigators in the past 3 years. I mention this not to be difficult, but because my methods and conclusions will carry more weight in a courtroom if my credentials are established from the outset." He looked at her for a moment that was 3 seconds long but felt considerably longer. "All right," he said. "Dr. Hale, I am Sheriff Robert Conroy. I am obliged you made the journey." "I was not obliged by charity," she said, setting her satchel on the nearest chair. "I was contracted. Now where is the ledger?" A lesser man might have been put out by her directness. Robert Conroy, she would learn, was not a lesser man. He crossed to his desk, opened the bottom drawer, and set the ledger on the desk with the careful, deliberate motion of someone handling something they believed to be significant. Alma picked it up. It was a standard commercial ledger of the kind sold at any stationery supplier, black cover, red binding along the spine, approximately 200 pages. The first thing she noticed was that the entries were arranged in columns like any accounting ledger, but the figures and notations were clearly not simple financial records. The characters were a mix of letters and numbers, and at first glance they had the appearance of random distribution. At first glance. She turned 3 pages slowly, tilting the book toward the light from the window, and something in her chest quietly ignited, the particular fierce pleasure of a mind meeting a problem that was actually interesting. "Has anyone else examined this?" she asked. 3 men, Robert said. "A schoolteacher, a retired military officer who served in the Telegraph Corps, and a man from Dodge City who claimed to be familiar with coded correspondence. None of them could read it." "None of them had my training," Alma said, without any particular vanity, as a simple statement of fact. "Do you have a spare desk I can use and a good lamp?" "I will need at least until morning to complete an initial frequency analysis." Robert Conroy looked at her with those gray eyes for another long moment, and then he pulled the chair out from the smaller desk in the corner and said, "It is yours." She sat down and opened her satchel and began to work, and she was so immediately absorbed in what she was doing that she almost forgot he was there. He did not leave, she noticed. He moved around the office with the quiet efficiency of a man accustomed to keeping his own company, checked his weapons, reviewed papers, made coffee, and eventually settled in his own chair with his long legs stretched out and his hat over his eyes in the attitude of a man who was not quite sleeping. He was not watching her. He was simply present, in the easy, uncomplicated way of a man who did not feel compelled to fill silence with noise. Alma found, to her surprise, that she did not mind. She had not always worked alone. In Washington she had colleagues, a small office, the particular intellectual companionship of people who understood her work. Out here she had expected to feel isolated. The presence of a quietly self-possessed man who asked nothing of her and did not interrupt was, she realized, not unpleasant. She worked through the evening and well into the night. The cipher, she established within the first 2 hours, was not a simple Caesar shift or a single alphabet substitution, which would have been trivial. It was a variant of the Wigner cipher, but with a significant modification. The key length was irregular, and the letter-number alternation pattern had been designed to defeat a standard Kasiski examination on first inspection. It was, she had to acknowledge, genuinely clever work. Whoever had designed this system had some real knowledge of cryptography, which told her something important. This was not a casual operation. This was organized, careful, and had been running for long enough that someone had taken the trouble to build a serious encryption system. By midnight she had identified the key pattern. By 2 in the morning she had confirmed it with a 3-page test translation. By 4 in the morning she was copying out the full translation in her precise, clear handwriting, column by column, entry by entry, and what was emerging on the page was making her jaw tighten with a cold, controlled anger. The ledger was a complete financial record of a criminal enterprise. It documented payments made to individuals identified by initials and codes that she was also systematically decoding for services that included intelligence on cattle movements, bank shipment schedules, property deed filings, law enforcement patrol routes, and in at least 6 entries that she read twice to be certain she had not misread them, for advance notice of settler arrivals on specific land parcels. The last category was the one that made her feel cold in a way that had nothing to do with the prairie night. Those settlers had been raided. She knew it because she had read, on the stage coming into Redemption, a 3-month-old copy of the Dodge City Times that mentioned a series of violent raids in Redemption County attributed to a gang called the Holloway Outfit. 2 families had been driven from their land. 1 man had been killed. Someone with access to official records had sold information to the Holloway gang. The ledger proved it, and now she could read who that someone was. She was so deep in the translation, so completely absorbed in the terrible clarity of what was forming under her pen, that she did not hear Robert get up. She became aware of him only when a mug of coffee appeared at the corner of her desk, set down with such careful quietness that it made barely a sound. She looked up. He was standing 2 feet away, looking at the pages of her translation with an expression that she could not entirely read, something between professional intensity and a more personal, more complicated emotion. "You are reading it," he said. It was not quite a question. "I have been reading it since approximately midnight," she said. "I will have the full translation complete before dawn." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "What is in it?" "Sit down," Alma said. "I will tell you what I have found so far, and I want you to understand that I am certain of my translation. Every entry I have rendered in English is correct. My methodology is sound, and I am prepared to document it step by step." He sat down on the edge of the nearest chair, leaning forward with his forearms on his knees, and he listened to her summarize the contents of the ledger with the focused, undemonstrative attention of a man who had learned to absorb bad news without flinching. When she told him about the patrol route intelligence, the fact that someone with knowledge of sheriff's office scheduling had been feeding information to the Holloway gang, something shifted in his face. It was very small and very controlled, but Alma was a professional observer of text and pattern, and she saw it. "You suspected it was an inside source," she said. "I suspected," he said, his voice absolutely level. "I did not want to believe it." "The ledger will tell us who," she said. "I am still working on the secondary code used for the identifying initials. Give me until morning." He held her gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then he nodded once, stood up, and went back to his desk. Alma drank her coffee and returned to the work, and the night stretched out around them, quiet and enormous and full of stars beyond the single dark window. The dawn came in pale gold and apricot over the Kansas plain, and with it came the name, Deputy Harris Cade. Alma set her pen down and read the entry a second time, and then a third, because she was a scientist and scientists verified their conclusions. The secondary code was a rotating numerical substitution keyed to the primary cipher's letter count, and once she had cracked it, it was consistent across every single entry. The initials, HC, appeared in 14 separate entries over a period of 22 months. The amounts paid were not small. The information provided was precise and operational, exactly the kind of detail that only someone with daily access to sheriff's office scheduling and county records could have supplied. It was devastating. It was also, Alma recognized with the particular clarity of someone who had spent years extracting truth from encoded text, absolutely certain. She looked across the office at Robert Conroy, who had fallen into a genuine sleep somewhere around 3 in the morning and was now awake again, standing at the stove with a fresh pot of coffee, his back to her. "Robert," she said. He turned at the sound of his first name, and something in his expression told her he had not expected her to use it. She had not planned to. It had come out of the specific gravity of what she was about to say. A formality like Sheriff Conroy felt obscenely inadequate for the moment. "I have the full translation," she said. "You need to read it, and I need to tell you who it is before you do, because I want you to hear it from me directly and not from the page." He crossed the room and stood beside her desk, and he was close enough that she could smell the coffee on him, and the faint, clean smell of cedar that she had noticed when she first walked in, and she had a sudden, unwelcome awareness of him as a person rather than a professional context, which she firmly set aside. She looked up at him and said the name. The ledger hit the desk. The inkwell rattled. And Robert Conroy stood there for a long, terrible moment with the expression of a man who has had the ground removed from beneath him. Harris Cade had been his deputy for 3 years. He had hired Cade himself, had trained him, had trusted him with patrol routes and evidence records, and the kind of institutional knowledge that a corrupt man could use to cause exactly the damage the ledger documented. Robert had eaten Sunday dinners at Cade's mother's house. He had stood up at Cade's wedding. Alma did not say anything. She understood, with the instinct of a woman who had learned to read not just codes but people, that what Robert needed in this moment was not comfort or explanation, but simply the presence of someone who was not going to look away from the truth with him. After a long silence he said, "How certain are you?" "Completely," she said. "I will show you the methodology. Step by step, every translation decision, every cipher key, every entry. I can reconstruct the entire decryption process in front of a judge if necessary. There is no ambiguity in the translation. Harris Cade's identifying code appears in 14 entries. The payments are documented, the intelligence provided is documented, and the dates correlate exactly with the Holloway gang's raids in this county." Robert's jaw was working slightly, the only outward sign of what was happening behind those gray eyes. Then he straightened, and Alma watched something settle into him, a deliberate, willed composure, the kind that comes not from the absence of feeling but from the decision to place duty above it. "Then we take him into custody today," he said, quietly, "before he has any reason to suspect we have the translation." "There is one more thing," Alma said. He looked at her. "The ledger also documents 4 additional contacts in Redemption County who provided ancillary information to the Holloway gang. The amounts are smaller and the intelligence less consistent, but the entries are there and they are clear." She passed him the last page of her translation. "One of them is the county clerk." Robert took the page, read it, and was quiet for a moment. "Caldwell," he said, and his voice was very flat. "The initials and the rotating code are consistent," Alma said. 3 entries, the most recent is 6 weeks ago." Robert set the page down with measured care. "Then we have more work to do than I thought." "We," Alma repeated, and there was a slight emphasis on the word that she had not quite intended. He looked at her directly. "You translated it. You understand it better than anyone. I am going to need you to stay." Alma opened her mouth to say that her contract was for document analysis and not for extended field consultation. And then she thought about the settler families in the ledger, about the man who had been killed, about the 6-week-old intelligence that meant the Holloway gang might strike again at any time if their source in the county clerk's office was still active. "I will stay through the investigation," she said. "But I want full access to any additional documents recovered, and I want your word that my translation will be submitted to the court as primary evidence with my name attached." "You have it," Robert said, and he said it immediately without hesitation, which told her something significant about who he was. The arrest of Harris Cade was, by Robert's deliberate management, the least dramatic event it could have been. He walked into the sheriff's office at 7 in the morning as he always did, hung up his hat, and found Robert standing at his desk and Alma seated at the corner desk with the translated ledger pages in front of her. And before he had fully processed that the woman was unknown to him, Robert had crossed the room and put his hand on Cade's arm with a grip that was gentle in its form and absolute in its intent. "Sit down, Harris," he said. Cade sat. He looked at Alma. He looked at the papers on her desk. And then he looked at Robert with an expression that moved very rapidly from confusion through something that might have been calculation, and then settled into a tired, defeated grief that Alma thought was the most honest thing he had shown anyone in a long time. He did not confess immediately. That came later, after the lawyer arrived from Dodge City, and after Robert had spent 2 hours alone with him in the lockup, with the translation pages laid out on the small table between them, methodical and irrefutable. Alma spent those 2 hours at the hotel, bathing off the previous night's work, eating a proper meal for the first time since she had arrived, and sitting at the window of her small room looking out at the broad, sunlit Kansas plain, and feeling the particular, specific exhaustion that came not from physical labor, but from having held a very high level of mental concentration for a very long time. She was also, she realized with some surprise, feeling something else, something like investment. Not just in the case, which was professionally interesting and morally significant, but in the outcome, in the town, in the families whose names she had read in that terrible ledger, who deserved to know that what had happened to them had been a betrayal purchased with deliberate money by a man they might have passed on the street and nodded to. She was also, if she was honest with herself, thinking about Robert Conroy, not in any way that she considered alarming, simply noticing, with the same analytical precision she brought to everything, that he was not what she had expected. She had worked with law enforcement before in Washington, in Baltimore, briefly in Philadelphia, and she had encountered a consistent pattern of dismissal, condescension, or performative acceptance that was only marginally better. Men who thanked her for her work and then spent the next hour explaining to each other what she had found, as though the finding had somehow transferred to them by proximity. Robert Conroy had not done that. He had listened to her with the complete, focused attention of a person who understood that he was in the presence of someone who knew more than he did about a specific thing, and who had no problem with that. He had used her first name when she gave it to him. He had brought her coffee in the night without asking whether she wanted it or making an event of it. And when she had told him a truth that was devastating, he had thanked her directly and meant it. She had found, in the course of a single night, exactly 2 kinds of men in her professional life, men who were threatened by her competence and men who were not. The first category was considerably larger. Robert Conroy was, with unusual completeness, the second kind. She finished her meal, straightened her hair, put on a fresh dress and went back to the sheriff's office. He was there when she arrived, sitting at his desk writing in a firm, precise hand. He looked up when she came in, and for a moment his expression was open in a way she had not quite seen before, not professional assessment, not the controlled gravity of a man managing a difficult situation, but something quieter and more unguarded. Then it settled back into its usual composed steadiness. "Cade is cooperating," he said. "He has confirmed the cipher key and the identifying codes." It matches your translation completely." "Of course it does," Alma said, and sat down at her desk. He made a sound that she realized after a moment was almost a laugh. She looked at him, surprised. He was looking at his papers, but there was a slight curve at the corner of his mouth that she had not previously observed. "I did not mean that arrogantly," she said, somewhat less certainly than she had intended. "I know," he said. "I believe it was accurate." She looked at him for a moment, and then, very slightly, she smiled. That was how it began, not with a grand gesture or a dramatic declaration, but with a near laugh and a slight smile in a dusty sheriff's office in the middle of the Kansas plain, between two people who were not looking for anything of the kind. The following weeks were full. The case against Harris Cade required extensive documentation, and the additional 4 names from the ledger required individual investigations, each of which produced its own complications and secondary evidence. The county clerk, a man named Caldwell, who Alma had only seen twice from a distance, turned out when cornered to be a much more frightened than malicious man who had been initially coerced and then maintained in cooperation by a combination of financial incentive and veiled threat. He cooperated fully once it was clear that cooperation was his only alternative to prosecution. The Holloway gang itself was a larger problem. The leader, a man named Declan Holloway, had been operating in southeastern Kansas and the northeastern corner of Indian Territory since at least 1879, and the ledger's information about his operation was useful, but did not directly lead to his location. A federal marshal was dispatched from Wichita within 2 weeks of Cade's arrest, and while the pursuit of Holloway himself would take considerably longer, the intelligence operation that had sustained him, the network of paid informants documented in the ledger, was effectively dismantled. Alma's role in those weeks was primarily technical. She produced a formal methodology document explaining the Cipher system, the key derivation process, and the translation approach, which would be submitted to the federal court as supporting evidence for her translation. She also examined 3 additional documents recovered from Cade's residence that turned out to be related correspondence written in the same cipher, which she translated within 48 hours of receiving them. She worked long days and some nights, and she became accustomed to the rhythm of the sheriff's office, to the particular quality of the afternoon light through the west window and the sound of the Main Street traffic outside. She became accustomed to Robert's coffee, which was strong and slightly bitter in a way she had initially found challenging and now preferred. She became accustomed to the quiet, focused atmosphere that he maintained, the sense of a place where serious work was done seriously. She also became accustomed to him. He was not, she discovered, a simple man. He was not educated in the way she was, had not had the opportunity for the formal study that had shaped her mind and her methods, but he had a quality of intelligence that she found, the more she observed it, genuinely remarkable, a three-dimensional, deeply practical intelligence that assembled and evaluated information in ways that were sometimes as elegant as anything she had seen in academic settings. He could read a witness's testimony and identify its inconsistencies with an instinct that she suspected was partly trained and partly native. He could look at a crime scene and construct a narrative of events that her own more formal analytical training might have taken considerably longer to assemble. They had long conversations in the evenings, when the work was done and the office quiet, about the case, about the evidence, about the legal process. The conversations sometimes drifted beyond the case, into territory that was less professional and more personal, and Alma noticed that she did not feel the particular tension she usually felt when conversations with men moved into personal territory. The wariness that came from experience with men who used personal conversation as a vehicle for something else. With Robert, personal conversation felt simply like the extension of a mind engaging honestly with another mind. He told her, one evening, about why he had become a lawman. He had grown up in Ohio, the son of a farmer, had come west at 19, and worked cattle drives for 3 years before a series of events that he described with the characteristic understatement of a man who has processed the past thoroughly enough that he can speak of it without performance. He had witnessed a robbery and killing on a trail drive north of Abilene, had been the one to ride for the law, and had found that the act of riding for justice rather than away from danger was the most natural thing he had ever done. He had worked as a deputy in 2 towns before being appointed sheriff of Redemption County at 28. He was currently 31. Alma told him, in turn, about her own path, the Stevens Institute, which had been formally open to women only in recent years, and where she had been one of 3 women in a program of 40 students, the particular combination of fascination with pattern and language that had drawn her toward cryptographic analysis, the network of connections through which her consulting work had grown. She told him about her father, a printer in Connecticut, who had given her unrestricted access to his press and his fonts from the time she was 8, and who had treated her intellectual curiosity as a normal and valued thing. She did not tell him about the men who had not, though she suspected from the way he listened that he understood the shape of what she did not say. It was on the 3rd Thursday of her time in Redemption that the evening conversation stayed longer than it had before, and something shifted. They had been talking about frequency analysis, Alma explaining, with the help of some scrap paper, how the statistical distribution of letters in any given language creates a fingerprint that makes ciphers vulnerable regardless of their apparent complexity, and Robert asking questions that were sharper and more perceptive than most people managed to ask about a subject they were encountering for the first time. At some point she had turned her chair toward his so that the scrap paper was between them on the corner of the desk, and they were both leaning toward it, and she had become aware simultaneously that the office had grown darker and quieter than she had realized, and that Robert was closer to her than he had been before. She looked up from the paper and found him looking at her. Not at the paper. At her. It was not a look she had misread the category of before. She had simply not expected it from him, or not expected it with the particular quality it had: direct and uncomplicated, with none of the apology or performance or strategic maneuvering she had seen in men who looked at her this way. He was looking at her the way he looked at things he was trying to understand fully, steadily, without flinching from what he saw. "Dr. Hale," he said, and his voice had a quality she had not heard in it before. Not softer exactly, something more deliberate. "Alma," she said, just as she had said it the morning she told him the name, and just as it had that morning, her use of it surprised him slightly. "Alma," he said, and the way he said it was very quiet and very careful, like something he was deciding whether to keep. "I want to ask you something that is not about the case." "Then ask it," she said. "How much longer does your contract run?" It was not what she had expected. She thought about it honestly. "The formal document work is essentially complete. The federal marshal has everything he needs from me. I could leave within the week." A long pause, the lamplight between them. "I would like it if you did not," he said. Alma looked at him steadily for a moment, and then she said, "On what basis?" The corner of his mouth moved again, that almost laugh, the one she had come to consider privately as one of the more useful tools in his considerable emotional arsenal. "Is that a professional question or a personal one?" "Both," she said. "I am a practical woman, Robert. I need to understand what is being proposed." He was quiet for a moment that she found, this time, comfortable rather than charged. Then he said, "There is a formal position available. The county has been talking about establishing an official records and documentation office for 2 years. The work keeps accumulating and nobody is managing it properly. I have the authority to appoint the position and the county has the funds for it." "And unofficially?" Alma asked. The pause this time was shorter, and the look he gave her was less guarded than anything she had seen from him before. "Unofficially," he said, "I have not had a single conversation in the last 3 weeks that I did not want to keep having." Alma sat with that for a moment, and she felt the particular quality of an honest admission from a private man, and she felt the weight of her own answer, which she already knew. "I will think about it," she said, which for Alma Hale was as close to yes as she was prepared to get on 3 weeks' acquaintance. He nodded, and she could see that he understood what she meant by it, and she found that she was profoundly grateful not to have to explain. She stayed. The formal appointment came through by the end of April. Alma Hale, Records and Documentation Analyst, Redemption County, Kansas, with a salary that was less than she had earned in Washington, but more than she had expected in a county of this size. She rented 2 rooms above the Mercantile from a woman named Clara Briggs, who was sharp-eyed and warm-hearted, and who made it clear within the first 10 minutes that she knew exactly who Robert Conroy was and approved of the general direction of events, which Alma found alternately amusing and mildly mortifying. The trial of Harris Cade, conducted in the county courthouse in Redemption in the second week of May, with a circuit judge brought in from Wichita, was the defining event of the town's spring. It drew more people than the courthouse could easily hold, and the gallery was packed and silent while Alma testified. She stood at the front of the courtroom in her best navy blue dress and explained with meticulous clarity the methodology by which she had decrypted the ledger, the statistical principles underlying her analysis, the step-by-step reconstruction of the cipher key, and the verified accuracy of every translated entry. She spoke for 2 hours. She did not use notes. She answered the defense attorney's cross-examination with the patient, precise confidence of a person who knew exactly what she had done and why, and when the attorney attempted to suggest that her translation might contain errors, she produced, from a folder on the table beside her, a 12-page technical appendix that she offered to walk him through at whatever level of detail he found useful. The defense attorney declined. In the gallery, Robert Conroy sat with his hat on his knee and his expression entirely steady, and Alma did not look at him directly during her testimony, because she found that, when she looked at him, the particular quality of composed steadiness was not something she could take for granted, and she needed to give her full attention to the judge. But she was aware of him, in the continuous, low-frequency way that she had become aware of him over the past weeks, and it was only after her testimony was done, and she was making her way back to her seat, and she caught his eye for a single moment across the crowded room that she understood, with the particular clarity of a person who does not lie to themselves about patterns, that she was entirely in love with him. Harris Cade was convicted on 12 counts of conspiracy, fraud, and accessory to assault. He received 15 years in the federal penitentiary in Leavenworth. The county clerk, Caldwell, received a lesser sentence in light of his cooperation, and the 3 other individuals identified in the ledger received various legal consequences appropriate to their specific roles. The Holloway gang itself was broken up over the summer by the federal marshal and a detachment of cavalry, after a pursuit that took several months and ranged into Indian Territory. Declan Holloway himself was killed in a standoff in the Osage Hills in late July. Alma read the Wire report in the sheriff's office on a Tuesday morning, and Robert set the paper down and said, with a quality of finality that seemed to release something, "That's done." "That's done," Alma agreed. The summer in Kansas was not like any summer she had experienced before. It was large and hot and furiously blue-skied, and the prairie around Redemption was a sea of bluestem grass and wildflowers that moved constantly in winds that came from distances she could not imagine. She had expected to find it isolating. Instead, she found it, with a surprise that she revisited periodically, genuinely beautiful in a way that Eastern landscapes were not, without the compression and complexity of the landscapes she had grown up in, simply enormous and present and full of a particular quality of light that was unlike anything she had a word for. She worked hard. The county records were genuinely disorganized, and bringing proper archival methodology to the accumulated chaos, of 2 decades of Frontier County administration, was a project substantial enough to keep her engaged for the foreseeable future. She also continued to provide analysis on coded correspondence when it came through the regional law enforcement network, which it did with some regularity, and this occasional work connected her to the broader professional world in a way that kept her from feeling entirely removed from the career she had built. She and Robert found their way toward each other with the particular, unhurried care of 2 people who were not in the habit of rushing things they valued. He called on her formally in the evening, twice a week, which was the recognized social convention, and which Clara Briggs observed with audible approval. They walked sometimes, along the main street and out to the edge of town where the prairie began properly, and they talked about everything: the cases that passed through the office, the state of county politics, the books that Alma read and that Robert did not but listen to her describe with genuine interest, the particular quality of the Kansas sky at different hours and seasons. He was not a demonstrative man. He was not given to easy affection or elaborate declaration. But Alma had learned, in the course of her professional life, to read what was actually being communicated rather than simply what was being said, and what Robert communicated, in the steadiness of his attention, in the specific and evidenced care he took, in the way he was always precisely where he had said he would be, was something she valued more than any elaborate performance could have been. He kissed her for the first time on a Saturday evening in early June, standing at the edge of the town on the far side of the livery stable, where the lane ran out into the open country, and the sky was doing something extraordinary in shades of copper and rose above the flat horizon. He had been saying something about a water rights dispute he was mediating between 2 ranch families, and she had been half listening and half watching the sky, and he had simply stopped talking, and when she looked at him, he was looking at her with the same direct, unperformative quality that had been characteristic of him from the beginning. And then he kissed her, and it was quiet and certain, and she kissed him back with the same quality. When they separated, he said, with the slight roughness in his voice that she had come to recognize as the outer edge of what he allowed himself to show, "I have been thinking about doing that for some time." "I know," she said. "I have been thinking about it too." "Then we are agreed," he said, and there was that near laugh again, and she found herself laughing properly in response, which was a feeling she associated specifically with him and with no one else. The summer deepened. They were by July agreed in the way that redemption could observe and approve of formally courting, which in the social context of a small Kansas town in 1882 was a thing with specific and understood meaning. Clara Briggs made a point of telling Alma that Robert Conroy was the steadiest man she had ever had occasion to observe, which was the kind of compliment that Clara, being who she was, considered absolutely definitive. There were difficulties that summer, of their own making and otherwise. Robert's work was not simple or safe. The county was still adjusting to the aftermath of the Cade revelations, navigating the reestablishment of trust that had been damaged by the discovery of corruption in the office, and there were incidents that required the kind of response that sent Alma's heart into a particular cold suspension for the duration of their resolution. There was a confrontation in August with a horse thief who had not intended to be caught, and who had expressed this intention with some immediacy, and Robert came back from it with a cut above his left eye and a slightly different quality of quiet that lasted for 24 hours before he processed it into its proper place. Alma, for her part, was not always easy to love. She was acutely intelligent, and occasionally allowed this to express itself as impatience. She had strong opinions, and did not routinely moderate them for social comfort. She had been independent for long enough that the adjustments required by genuine intimacy were not always natural to her, and there were evenings when she was absorbed in work or thought to the point of near total inaccessibility, which she recognized intellectually as something she owed him clarity about, and which she was, in practice, working on. What made it work, what she understood more clearly as the summer went on, was that Robert did not want her to be different from what she was. He was not in love with a softened or accommodated version of her. He was in love with the woman who had walked into his office with 3 published monographs and a derringer in her bag, and had told him to call her doctor, and had then sat down and spent the night dismantling an encryption system that had defeated everyone else. He valued her competence not as a novelty, but as a genuine quality of the person he had chosen, and the security of being valued for your actual self, in Alma's experience, was not a thing you took lightly or let go of without thought. He asked her to marry him on an evening in September, sitting on the step of her rented rooms above the Mercantile after a long day of trial preparation for one of the subsidiary cases related to the Cade investigation. He did not have a speech prepared. He said, "Alma, I want to spend my life with you. I want to come home to you and talk to you and work beside you and have children with you if you are willing. I know this is not the kind of place you came from, and I know that I am not the kind of man you expected to meet here. But I love you, and I believe you love me, and I would like to know what you think about that." It was, Alma reflected, entirely characteristic of him, honest and direct and without decoration, and for exactly that reason, exactly right. She said, "I think you are entirely correct on all counts, and yes." He kissed her on the step above the Mercantile while Clara Briggs made a sound through the open window above them that was probably not entirely accidental. They were married in November of 1882 in the small church at the north end of Redemption's Main Street, on a Saturday morning when the sky was the particular, hard, brilliant blue of late autumn on the Kansas plains. Alma wore a dress that she had ordered from a dressmaker in Wichita, deep blue wool, fitted at the waist, with small buttons of ivory all the way down the front, and her hair, which was dark and long, and usually pinned back with the efficient practicality of a woman who considered her hair a neutral matter, was arranged by Clara Briggs in something considerably more elaborate than its usual state, which Alma submitted to with the particular combination of gracious tolerance and mild amusement that had become her default mode for Clara's more exuberant social interventions. Robert was waiting at the front of the church in his good suit, which was dark gray, and which fitted him with the slightly unyielding formality of a garment not frequently worn, and when Alma came through the door on the arm of Silas Hale, her father who had made the journey from Connecticut, Robert looked at her with an expression that was entirely unguarded, for one moment open and full and deeply certain, before he composed himself again, and she walked toward him with the strong, clear sense of walking toward exactly the right place. The Reverend Matthias, who was a careful man with a fondness for brevity, conducted the ceremony with admirable efficiency. They said their vows in front of the assembled population of Redemption and a scattering of county officials, and when it was done and Robert kissed her not for the first time, but for the first time publicly, the room produced a sound that was distinctly warm. They had a small gathering at the hotel afterward, which lasted into the evening and which featured a great deal of the particular festivity that a frontier community brings to the occasions it considers worth celebrating. And Silas Hale had 3 glasses of the hotel's best whiskey, and made a speech about his daughter that was so accurate and so loving that Alma had to study the middle distance for a full minute. Robert, characteristically, did not make a speech. He stood beside her with his hand at the small of her back and spoke to their guests individually and with attention, and somewhere around 8 in the evening Alma noticed that his expression had acquired a kind of steady, contained happiness that was the most demonstrative she had ever seen from him, which she found, given that she was its source, extraordinarily gratifying. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was mild by Kansas standards, which still meant temperatures that made the morning walk to the county building an event requiring serious preparation. But the sheriff's house, which was a proper house, 2 stories of frame construction on the east side of Redemption's Main Street, with a kitchen large enough to actually work in and windows on 3 sides of the upper story, was warm. and Alma found the experience of wintering in it, rather than in rented rooms above a mercantile, considerably more pleasant than she had anticipated. She continued her work at the county records office, which had been formalized as a permanent position by this point, and which had also expanded to include consulting on coded correspondence for the Federal Marshal's District, which brought regular and interesting material. She was corresponding with two colleagues in Washington about a paper she was writing on the practical application of polyalphabetic cipher analysis to criminal investigation, the first paper of its kind, she believed, to draw on actual case evidence from frontier law enforcement, and the redemption case was its central example. Robert's work was its own ongoing complex universe. The transition period after the Cade revelations had required months of careful work to rebuild the office's reputation and relationship with the county population, particularly among the farming and ranching communities that had been most directly affected by the Holloway gang's raids. He hired two new deputies, younger men named Garrett and Foss, and trained them himself with a thoroughness that Alma observed from the outside and admired without reservation. It was in the second winter of their marriage, in January of 1884, that their son was born. They named him James after Robert's father, with the middle name Silas after Alma's, which Robert had suggested himself and which caused Silas Hale, when informed by letter, to write back a response that was slightly incoherent with pleasure. James arrived in the middle of a January snowstorm with the assistance of the town doctor, a steady woman named Frances Morrison, who had been practicing medicine in Redemption for 4 years, and whose calm competence Alma appreciated more than she could express. And the birth was long and difficult, and Robert spent most of it in the next room with a degree of controlled anxiety that Alma was told about afterward by Clara Briggs, who had been in the house assisting, and which touched her in a very specific place. When it was done and she was exhausted, and the room smelled of wood smoke and clean linen, and Dr. Morrison was being her characteristic efficient self at the far end of the room, Robert came in and sat beside her and held their son for the first time, and the expression on his face was entirely and helplessly full. "Hello, James," he said, very quietly, and Alma, who had not cried during any part of the previous 16 hours, felt the back of her throat tighten with something warm and complete. "He has your jaw," she said. Robert looked up at her. "Heaven help him." She laughed, and then regretted laughing because laughing required muscles she had been using for the past 16 hours, and he watched her with the close attention of a man who was simultaneously assessing her physical state and trying not to show how recently frightened he had been, and she took his hand where it rested beside her on the blanket and held it. The spring brought new growth in more ways than one. James Conroy was, from his earliest weeks, a person with strong opinions and consistent methods for expressing them, which Alma privately considered inevitable given his parentage. He was also, she felt compelled to note in her correspondence to various family members and colleagues, extremely beautiful, which she acknowledged was not an objective assessment but which she was prepared to defend. Robert was, as a father, entirely himself, steady, attentive, and absolutely genuine. He did not perform fatherhood. He did not treat it as a separate sphere from the rest of his life. He held his son and talked to him as though he were a rational being receiving information, and Alma found watching this so consistently satisfying that she was occasionally required to look away from it to focus on other things. The county continued to grow through 1884 and into 1885. The railroad arrived at the edge of Redemption County, which brought both economic growth and the particular complications that a railroad connection brought to frontier communities. Alma's records and documentation work expanded substantially, and she hired an assistant, a young man named Theodore Marsh from a farming family east of town who had a natural aptitude for organized record-keeping, and who turned out to be an enthusiastic student of her document analysis methods. She finished her paper on cipher analysis in criminal investigation in the autumn of 1884 and submitted it to the Journal of the Proceedings of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, where it was accepted and published in the spring of 1885. It was the first paper in the journal's history to have a woman's name as the sole author on a topic of applied cryptographic analysis, and the response letters from researchers and investigators across the country, several requests for consulting work, and a formal inquiry from the Army Signal Corps constituted a kind of recognition that Alma received with precise and genuine satisfaction. Robert read it in the deliberate way that he read anything that was important to Alma fully, without rushing, stopping periodically to ask questions that were always more insightful than the questions of people with formal training in the field, which she had stopped being surprised by. When he was done, he set it on the kitchen table between them and said, "This is extraordinary work." "It is solid work," she said, which was her actual assessment. "It is extraordinary solid work," he said, with a slight emphasis that served him as insistence, and she accepted the amendment. That was their way, his directness meeting her precision, his steadiness meeting her intensity, each of them giving the other something that was genuinely needed and genuinely irreplaceable. It was in 1886 that the second piece of the original story arrived, unexpectedly, and completed something that had been waiting to be completed. A man named Albert Das, who had been one of the smaller and more marginal figures identified in the ledger, a farmhand who had once reported settler movements to Cade for a single payment of $20, had served his sentence in the county jail and been released 2 years earlier. Alma had thought very little about him after his conviction, which had been a minor matter in the context of the larger investigation. He appeared at the county record's office on a Tuesday morning in March, hat in hand, and asked to speak to her. Alma set down her pen and looked at him across the counter. He was 40-something, weathered with the permanent squint of a man who had spent decades working outdoors, and he looked at her with an expression that was not threatening but was carrying something heavy. "I heard your paper," he said. "A man read it aloud at a gathering in Wichita, someone who thought it was interesting. I want to hear it because I knew your name." Alma waited. "I want you to know," he said with a considerable effort that she could see, "that the family who lost that land, the Hartley family they were called, they are living in Colorado now. I know because I made it my business to find out. I sent them money, not enough to make it right. Nothing would make it right, but I sent it." Alma was quiet for a moment, looking at him carefully. "That does not undo the harm," she said, "but it is something." "I know it is not enough," he said. "I wanted to tell you because you were the one who found it out, and I wanted you to know what I did with the knowing." He left, and Alma stood at the record's office counter for a moment in the quiet, thinking about the Hartley family in Colorado and about Frank Tully, whose body had been found by the Cimarron River with a coded ledger on him, and about the chain of events that had led from that morning in April 1882 to this Tuesday morning in 1886, and about the way that documented truth, however difficult to extract, had consequences that continued to propagate in ways that were not always visible. Then she went back to her desk and picked up her pen, because there was work to do. James turned 2 in January of 1886 and developed, over the spring and summer of that year, a comprehensive set of social opinions about the various adults in his life, the horses in the livery, and the dog that belonged to Clara Briggs and who made regular visits to the sheriff's house with the proprietary confidence of a small, shaggy ambassador. He called the dog Bit, which was not the dog's name but which stuck with such force that even Clara eventually adopted it. He was a child who wanted to know everything about everything, which meant that Alma's kitchen table had become, by the time he was old enough to sit at it, a location where questions about the world were asked and answered with the same seriousness with which the adults of the house approached everything else. Robert answered questions about horses and weather, and the mechanics of how rivers changed their courses with the same direct, informative quality he brought to everything. Alma answered questions about why letters looked the way they did, and whether numbers could lie, and why the sky was one color in the morning, and another at noon, with the same precise enthusiasm she brought to everything. James, absorbing all of this with his father's steadiness and his mother's appetite for understanding, was by the age of 3.5 a person who asked more questions in a single morning than most adults asked in a week, and who did not accept, because that is how it is, as a complete answer to any of them. Robert and Alma both found this entirely correct. The second child arrived in the autumn of 1887, on a golden October day when the prairie was the color of old copper, and the trees along the Cimarron had turned to fire. They named her Alina, after Robert's mother, with the middle name Frances after Dr. Morrison, who had delivered her with the same calm efficiency she had brought to James 3 years earlier. Alina was, from the beginning, a different kind of person than her brother, quieter, more observant, with a tendency to watch situations carefully before committing to a view, which Alma recognized as a quality she shared, and which Robert observed with the knowing appreciation of a man who had spent several years living with a very intelligent, very deliberate woman. By the late autumn of 1887, the Conroy household was a full and busy and genuinely happy place, and Alma found herself on an October evening standing at the upper window of their house, with Alina sleeping in the cradle beside her, and James asleep down the hall and Robert's footsteps on the stairs, looking out at the Kansas plain under a sky extravagant with stars, and thinking that this was not what she had come here for in April of 1882, and that it was much better than what she had come for. Robert appeared in the doorway and came to stand beside her, looking out at the same sky. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I am thinking," Alma said, "that the index of coincidence for happiness is considerably higher than I expected when I got off the stage in this town." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "That is the most you kind of thing you have ever said to me." "That is a compliment," she said. "Yes," he said, "it is." He put his arm around her, and she leaned against him, and the prairie stretched out below them, enormous and dark and full of stars, and the night was quiet in the way that the Kansas night was always quiet, not empty, but full of its own particular, enormous presence. 3 days later, on a Thursday morning in early November, a wire arrived at the sheriff's office from the federal marshal's district in Wichita. Alma was in the records office when Deputy Garrett brought it over, and she read it standing at her counter. It was a request for her professional consultation on a coded document recovered from a financial fraud case in the Wichita Federal District, a cipher that the district's investigators had been unable to crack for 6 weeks. The wire described the document's characteristics in enough detail for Alma to recognize that it would be an interesting problem. A doubly encrypted accounting record using what sounded, from the description, like a variant of the Beaufort cipher overlaid on a numerical substitution base. She sent back a reply accepting the commission, arranged for Theodore to manage the county records in her absence, and spent the evening telling Robert about it while James, at the table, drew horses on the back of an old census form with a piece of charcoal and occasionally offered commentary on adult conversation that was more perceptive than strictly expected. "How long?" Robert said. 2 weeks at most, Alma said. "The Beaufort is not difficult once you have the key, and the numerical substitution is usually straightforward if the base alphabet is standard." "I have absolute confidence," he said, which was both entirely sincere and slightly dry, which was his mode when he was allowing himself to show that something mattered. She went to Wichita the following Monday on the morning stage, and she was back in 12 days with the full translation of the fraud document, which turned out to document a bank embezzlement scheme involving 3 officers of a Kansas railway company, and which resulted in the arrests of all 3 within a month. The paper trail of her professional reputation was growing longer and more substantial, connecting redemption, Kansas to the larger world of applied cryptographic analysis, in ways that made her position here feel not like an exile from her work, but like the place from which her work was growing. She had made something real in this town, not just professionally, but in every dimension that mattered. She had built a life that was entirely hers, entirely chosen, and entirely what she would choose again. In the spring of 1889, Kansas was on the edge of significant change. The population had grown substantially through the decade, and with statehood firmly established and the frontier pushing further west, the particular quality of life that had defined places like Redemption in 1882 was beginning to give way to something somewhat more structured and somewhat less raw. Robert was re-elected sheriff for the third time in 1888 by a margin that reflected the degree to which the county's trust in its law enforcement had been thoroughly rebuilt over the years since the Cade revelations. He ran the office now with a quality of authority that was different from what it had been in 1882, not harder or more closed, but more settled, more fully formed. He was 38 years old and had spent a decade doing one of the harder jobs on the frontier with an integrity that was recognized across the district, and the weight of that was visible in him without being heavy. He wore it the way he wore everything else without performance, as simply what was true. James was 5 in January of 1889 and had begun his formal schooling in the fall of 1888, which he approached with the combination of enthusiasm and critical evaluation that was entirely predictable given his temperament. He came home from school with questions about why certain things were taught the way they were, and Alma answered the questions honestly, and Robert confirmed that asking them was correct. And between the two of them, they managed to support both his education and his independent thinking in ways that the schoolteacher, a patient and intelligent woman named Mrs. Harlow, seemed to view with general approval. Eleanor, at 18 months, was becoming rapidly and comprehensively mobile, which transformed the Conroy household from a busy but manageable environment into something closer to an ongoing tactical situation. And Alma and Robert navigated it with the same quality of joint attention they brought to everything efficiently, without unnecessary drama, and with a great deal of genuine amusement at the spectacle Eleanor made of herself discovering the world. On a May morning in 1889, with the prairie green from a wet spring and the air full of the particular, clean smell of new grass, Alma was standing at the kitchen window watching Robert in the yard behind the house, where he was teaching James, with characteristic patience, the basics of caring for a horse. James was standing beside the horse, a gentle bay gelding named Moses, who was broadly tolerant of small people, with his hands moving through the motions Robert was showing him, and his expression had the precise, focused quality that Alma recognized as deep engagement, and Robert's hand was on his son's shoulder guiding the motion, and the morning light was coming in low and golden from the east, and Alma stood at the kitchen window and felt, with a completeness that was not dramatic but was entire, the specific, irreducible happiness of a life that was fully, genuinely hers. She had come here to translate a cipher. She had translated it completely and correctly when 3 men before her had failed. She had given a sheriff the truth he needed to dismantle a criminal network that had been bleeding his county for 2 years. She had stayed because the work continued, and because the man she had stayed near had turned out to be worth staying near, and because the place itself had worked on her in ways she had not anticipated and did not resist. She had built a practice, a reputation, a household, a family. She had produced work that was being read by investigators and researchers in cities she had not yet visited and would visit in time. She had translated the particular hidden language of this place, its codes, its secrets, its capacity for both harm and repair, and she had done it with the full force of a mind that had never been anything other than exactly what it was. She picked up Eleanor from the cradle in the corner, and Eleanor, with the absolute confidence of a child who has never had reason to doubt that she will be caught, immediately grabbed a handful of her mother's hair and showed it a piece of bread she was holding in the other hand. "Hello," Alma said to her daughter. "That is my hair. I am aware." Alina made a sound that was emphatically positive and waved the bread. "Your father is outside," Alma said, and Alina, who had her father's gray eyes and the particular quality of watchful attention that she had clearly inherited from both of them, looked toward the window with an expression of immediate and comprehensive interest. Alma carried her outside into the May morning, and Moses turned his broad, amiable head at the sound of the door, and James said, "Mama," with the distracted generosity of a child who is currently engaged with something important, and Robert looked up from the horse's shoulder and met her eyes across the yard. He looked at her with the particular expression that was his alone, direct and unperformative and fully present, and she looked back at him across the yard with their daughter on her arm and their son beside him and the prairie morning enormous around them, and she thought, "This is what it is. This is the translated version. This is what was hidden in the cipher. This, precisely." The autumn of 1889 brought a third child into the world, another son, born in September with considerable enthusiasm and a remarkable set of lungs. They named him Daniel. Robert had said the name quietly one evening, and Alma had said, "Yes, that is the right one." And it had been settled in approximately 15 seconds, which was characteristic of how they made decisions together. Daniel arrived in the world looking at everything with an expression of intense evaluation that Dr. Morrison said she had not seen on a newborn in 20 years, and Alma said she believed it. James was now 6 and understood, with the matter-of-fact acceptance of a child whose parents had treated him with consistent honesty, that the arrival of a new sibling was a significant event that would require adjustment from everyone, including him. He offered to teach Daniel about horses when Daniel was old enough, which he said would probably be 3 years from now. Robert told him that was probably about right. The Conroy household at the end of 1889 was full to its particular brim. 3 children, 2 careers, 1 large and patient dog that had been given to them by a grateful farmer, and that Alina had immediately named Big, which was accurate and full in the specific way of a life that has been built by people who know what they want and who have worked consistently toward it. Alma's consulting practice had grown in ways that she found genuinely satisfying. She had now worked on 14 coded documents for federal investigators across Kansas, Missouri, and the Indian Territory, and her paper had been cited in 2 subsequent publications and generated a correspondence with a researcher at Johns Hopkins University who was interested in the mathematical foundations of cipher analysis. She was writing a second paper, longer and more theoretical than the first, that she hoped to submit by the following spring. Robert had been approached about a federal appointment, something to do with district law enforcement coordination that would have meant a move to Wichita, more authority, more resources, more status. He had thought about it for 3 days and then told the federal representative with his characteristic directness that he was not interested. When Alma asked him why, she would have supported whatever he decided, he said, "Because the work here is not finished, and because this is where we are from." The phrase settled in her with the particular resonance of something important being named. This is where we are from. Not where he was from, not where she had come from by the stage in April of 1882, but where they were from jointly, collectively, by the compound fact of everything they had built here together. She thought about that for a while, and then she sat down at her desk and wrote a letter to her contact at the Army Signal Corps declining a proposed 6-week consulting residency in Washington, and proposing instead a correspondence consultation arrangement that would allow her to do the work from Redemption. The letter was accepted. The work was done by mail and courier, in the evenings after the children were asleep, at the kitchen table where James had once drawn horses with charcoal and Alina had once waved bread at her hair. In the spring of 1890, The ledger that had been the beginning of everything was returned to Redemption County from the federal court archives in Wichita, where it had been held as evidence through the years of trials and appeals. It arrived in a sealed package, and Alma opened it on her records office counter and held it for a moment, looking at the black cover and the red spine binding. She had not looked at it since the morning of Harris Cade's conviction, nearly 8 years earlier. She opened it to the first page of entries and looked at the columns of coded text, the letter-number mixtures, the irregular spacing, the careful, deliberate obscurity of a man who had wanted to make sure that what he was doing could not be proven. He had been wrong about that. Alma Hale had been right. She carried the ledger to the sheriff's office, set it on the desk, Robert's desk, her husband's desk, the same desk it had been placed on the night she arrived, and sat down in the chair across from it. Robert came in from the street a few minutes later, saw her, saw the ledger, and sat down in his own chair with the particular quality of weight that a man brings to a moment he recognizes as significant. They looked at the ledger for a moment together. 8 years, he said. Almost exactly, she said. What do you think we should do with it? Alma considered it. The ledger was county property, technically, but the cases it had supported were closed. It had no further evidentiary function. It was, in a sense, simply a document, an object that had once contained a hidden truth, which had been found and translated and used, and which had then done what documents do when their work is finished. I think, she said, that it belongs in the county records archive, properly cataloged and preserved, so that people can know what happened here if they ever need to. Robert was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "That is the right answer." "It usually is," she said. And he made the sound that was almost a laugh, and she smiled. And they sat together in the sheriff's office on a spring morning in 1890, with the familiar sounds of Redemption's Main Street coming through the open door, and the ledger on the desk between them and the full, specific weight of everything they had built together in the 8 years since that ledger had first appeared. And it was exactly enough. Alma Hale, Alma Conroy, she was both. She answered to both without preference, had translated the cipher. She had done it completely, correctly, and thoroughly, when the sheriff had thought it unreadable, and 3 other men before her had confirmed that verdict. She had translated every single entry, every transaction, every name, every payment, every betrayal encoded in those careful columns. She had also, she reflected, translated something harder and more valuable. The hidden language of this place, this life, this man who had looked at her from the beginning as if she were exactly what she was. The cipher of a frontier town that was more than it appeared, of a law officer who was worth every bit of the trust he asked for, of a kind of happiness she had not known she was looking for, and which she had found in the process of looking for something else entirely. The spring light came through the window of the sheriff's office and fell across the ledger and the desk and the worn floorboards, and outside the door the town of Redemption, Kansas, went about the business of its morning. And inside the office Alma looked at Robert and he looked at her, and it was, as it had always been between them, entirely clear. She reached across the desk and picked up the ledger and opened it to the last page of coded entries, the page she had translated last, on the morning she named the name, and she looked at the ciphertext one final time. Then she closed it and set it gently down, and the archive of Redemption County's history was exactly one document richer, and one of its most important secrets was finally, fully, and permanently understood. The morning went on around them. James would be home from school at midday with new questions. A leaner would need to be collected from Clara Briggs, who had been watching her since 8. Daniel was asleep upstairs in the crib under the window where the light was warm, sleeping with the profound conviction of a baby who has no concept yet of any of the difficulty the world contains, and who is right not to. Robert stood up and put on his hat and went about the work of the day, and Alma tucked the ledger under her arm and walked back across the main street to the county records office, and the spring air was clean and enormous around her, and the Kansas sky above her was the particular, hard, brilliant blue that she had learned, in the years since April 1882, was the specific color of the place where she was from. And she was home.